Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a place for soldiers, not for a civilian consultant on a field trip. Try not to get stepped on the crowd of raw recruits, their heads shaved and their confidence of brittle new armor, chuckled nervously. They stood in the sweltering South Carolina heat, a sea of green fatigues and nervous energy, their eyes flicking between the towering, barrel-chested drill Sergeant Keller and the small, unassuming woman standing beside him. She was perhaps 5'4", with strands of silver woven through a simple, tied-back ponytail and the kind of soft, unremarkable features that were designed to be forgotten. She wore plain khaki pants and a simple blue polo shirt, a stark contrast to the rigid uniformity surrounding her. She offered no reaction to the insult, no flicker of anger, no defensive retort. Her gaze remained level, her hands clasped loosely behind her back, her posture a study in placid neutrality. But when the base commander, Colonel Eva Rostova, saw that woman's stance from her office window, the subtle, almost imperceptible shift of weight to the balls of her feet, the perfect alignment of her spine, a cold dread mixed with profound respect washed over her. Rostova knew what that stance meant. She knew who she was looking at, and she knew that drill Sergeant Keller, a man who measured worth in decibels and biceps, had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his career. If you believe that true strength is measured not in words but in deeds, type respect below. This woman, whose name was Alara Vance, was a ghost, a whisper in the annals of modern warfare, a name spoken only in classified briefings and whispered with reverence in the halls of the Pentagon. To the world, she was nobody. To the few who knew, she was a living legend, a scalpel in a world of hammers. But here, on the scorched asphalt of Fort Jackson, she was just an obstacle, a civilian intrusion into the sacred crucible of making soldiers. Keller, emboldened by her silence, continued his tirade, his voice a gravelly roar meant to impress the recruits and establish his dominance. "This is my forge, ma'am. I hammer boys and men here. It's loud, it's dirty, and it's dangerous. There's no room for observers." He gestured vaguely at her, a motion of dismissal. The recruits, feeding on his arrogance, shuffled their feet, their collective gaze a mixture of pity and contempt for the woman who didn't belong. The air was thick with the smell of pine needles, sweat, and the institutional arrogance that permeates places where hierarchies are absolute. Vance simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Understood, drill sergeant," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying no trace of the humiliation being heaped upon her. Her silence was not weakness. It was a fortress. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane, a space of such profound self-possession that Keller's verbal onslaught simply broke against it, dissipating into the humid air like steam. He was shouting at a mountain, and the mountain was not listening. The command was given to move out, a sharp, guttural bark from Keller that sent the platoon of 90 recruits surging forward like a tidal wave. "Move! To the CQC course. Now. They were a clumsy, uncoordinated mass of limbs and anxiety, eager to prove their worth by following the order with maximum velocity. The narrow walkway outside the barracks became a choke point, a torrent of green fabric and heavy boots. Alara Vance stood her ground near the cinderblock wall, intending to let the wave pass. But in their haste, in their youthful desire to impress the roaring drill sergeant, they saw her not as a person, but as a part of the landscape to be bypassed. A burly recruit from Iowa, his face flushed with exertion, shouldered past her without a word. Another, smaller but just as eager, jostled her from the other side. The cumulative force of their passage was undeniable. She was pushed, not with overt malice, but with the far more insulting force of complete and utter disregard. Her shoulder blade met the rough, painted surface of the barracks wall with a dull thud. For a single, suspended moment, she was pinned there, a small, still island in a river of oblivious men. A few of them noticed, their eyes widening for a fraction of a second before they looked away, too afraid to acknowledge the breach of conduct, too intimidated by Keller's presence to offer an apology. They chose the path of least resistance, which was to pretend she didn't exist. Keller saw it all. He stood 10 feet away, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. He saw her being pressed against the wall, saw the silent indignity of the moment, and he did nothing. His inaction was a roaring endorsement of his recruit's behavior. It was a lesson. In his world, the strong and the loud prevail. The quiet and the small get pushed aside. It was the law of the jungle, and he was its self-appointed king. Vance, for her part, simply absorbed the impact. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. She waited for the river to pass, her breathing even, her expression unchanged. When the last recruit had thundered by, she pushed herself off the wall with a quiet grace, brushing a speck of dust from her sleeve that wasn't there. It was a small, methodical gesture of resetting herself, of reclaiming her space. Her focus was absolute. She looked down at her hands, flexing them once. They were steady. They were always steady. They were the hands of a watchmaker, a surgeon, a master craftsman. They were hands that had field-stripped rifles in total darkness under enemy fire, hands that had sutured wounds with scavenged fishing line, hands that had held the fate of nations in their calm, unwavering grip. Keller, seeing her composure, mistook it for frailty, for a civilian's inability to process the raw energy of his domain. He strode over, his shadow falling over her. See what I mean, ma'am? It's a rough environment. Maybe you should watch the rest of the exercise from the observation tower. For your own safety. The condescension dripped from every word. He was offering her an exit, a chance to retreat from a world she clearly didn't understand. Her reply was simple, her gaze lifting to meet his for the first time. I'm fine, drill sergeant. I prefer to observe from the ground. Her calm was unnerving. It wasn't defiance. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same finality as a physicist describing the law of gravity. It was a calm that hinted at a deep, unsettling reservoir of experience, a stillness forged in crucibles far hotter than this manufactured one. Keller, unable to comprehend its source, could only process it as a challenge to his authority. He grunted, turning away. Your funeral. Don't get in the way. But as she followed the platoon towards the live fire course, her walk was different. The unassuming shuffle was gone, replaced by an efficient, gliding gait that consumed the ground with minimal effort. Her eyes, which had seemed placid and unfocused, were now sharp, constantly scanning, assessing angles, noting exits, evaluating the terrain. The ghost was beginning to wake up. The close quarters combat course, known colloquially as the kill house, was a labyrinth of plywood walls, hinge doors, and pop-up targets designed to simulate the brutal, claustrophobic reality of urban warfare. It was a place of controlled chaos, of shouted commands, and the deafening report of M4 rifles firing blanks. Drill Sergeant Keller stood on a raised catwalk, a god in his own small machine, bellowing instructions through a megaphone. Alpha Team, on me. Breach, bang, and clear. I want to see aggression. I want to see violence of action. You are the hammer. Go! The first team of 4 recruits, clumsy and overstimulated, burst through the door. They moved like startled deer, bumping into each other, their muzzle awareness dangerously sloppy. One of them tripped over a threshold, nearly sending his rifle flying. Keller's roar of disapproval echoed across the training ground. Pathetic. You called it a dynamic entry. My grandmother moves with more tactical purpose. Reset. Do it again. Alara Vance stood near the entrance, just outside the designated safety line, her arms crossed. She wasn't watching the recruits. She was watching Keller. She observed his methods, his reliance on volume and intimidation, his focus on aggression over precision. He was teaching them to be loud, not effective. He was teaching them to be hammers, forgetting that sometimes the mission required a key. The sun beat down, turning the air into a shimmering soup. The smell of gunpowder and hot would fill the space. Another team went through, then another, each attempt a variation on the same theme of clumsy enthusiasm. They were trying to replicate the fluid, hyper-competent movements they had seen in movies, but their bodies, still new to the weight of body armor and the awkward geometry of a rifle, betrayed them. They were a collection of parts, not a cohesive unit. The exercise was designed to be simple. Enter a room, identify and engage the hostile targets, black silhouettes with a crude drawing of an AK-47, and bypass the civilian targets, blue silhouettes of a woman holding a child. But under pressure, the recruits' minds turned to static. They shot civilians. They missed hostiles. They flagged each other with their muzzles, a cardinal sin that earned them another verbal lashing from the catwalk. Keller was growing increasingly frustrated, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. His inability to transfer his will onto these fumbling recruits was a direct assault on his ego. He saw their failure as his own, and it enraged him. What is wrong with you people? The target is right there. It's not moving. How hard can it be? He bellowed, his voice cracking with exasperation. From her vantage point, Vance saw the problem clearly. It wasn't the recruits' aggression, but their perception. They were so overwhelmed by the sensory input, the noise, the speed, the pressure to perform, that they weren't truly seeing what was in front of them. They were reacting to a script in their heads, not to the reality of the room. They were looking, but they were not observing. A new scenario was introduced. Keller, in an attempt to increase the pressure, added a complication. New intel. We have a high-value target in the final room, but we have confirmed reports of an explosive device rigged to a hostage. You must neutralize the 3 hostile targets without hitting the hostage and without triggering the device. The trigger is pressure-sensitive, linked to the HVT. You shoot him, the bomb goes off. You have 10 seconds from breach to neutralize. Go! This was a far more complex problem, one that required not just speed, but surgical precision and instantaneous decision-making. It was a test of soldiers' mind, not just their reflexes. The next team, led by the same burly recruit who had shoved Vance against the wall, looked terrified. The weight of the new instructions was a physical burden. They stacked up on the door, their movements hesitant. Go! Keller screamed. They burst in. The room was a chaotic tableau. 3 hostile targets were positioned around a blue civilian silhouette sitting in a chair, a crude bomb vest strapped to its chest. The HVT target stood directly behind the hostage, a sliver of its black outline visible over the hostage's shoulder. It was an impossible shot for a novice. It was a shot that required an almost supernatural understanding of angles, trajectory, and timing. The recruit, whose name was Peterson, raised his rifle. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence that had suddenly fallen as everyone held their breath. He saw the sliver of black behind the blue. 10 seconds. Keller's voice was a roaring inferno in his mind. Violence of action. He took a breath, his front sight post wavering like a nervous mirage. He knew, on some level, that he couldn't make the shot, but the alternative, failure, was worse. He squeezed the trigger. The blank round cracked, a hollow pop in the tense air. A puff of smoke. He had missed the hostile, and, in his haste, his barrel had dipped, and he had put a simulated round directly into the chest of the blue hostage target. A loud, obnoxious buzzer blared, the electronic scream of catastrophic failure. The bomb had detonated, the hostage was dead, but the failure cascaded. In the split second of the buzzer's shriek, another recruit, startled by the noise and the sudden confirmation of their failure, flinched. His finger tightened on his own trigger reflexively. His rifle, pointed carelessly towards the corner of the room where a ranged safety officer was monitoring the exercise, discharged. The safety officer, a seasoned sergeant, dove to the ground, a curse on his lips. The situation was no longer a simulation of chaos. It was chaos itself. The recruits froze, their minds overloaded, their bodies locked in place by panic. Peterson just stood there, his rifle lowered, staring at the hostage target he had just killed. Keller, on the catwalk, was paralyzed for a full second. His script had no page for this. His tools of intimidation and volume were useless against the sudden, sharp reality of a safety breach and a complete breakdown of discipline. The exercise had spiraled out of his control. In that moment of collective paralysis, Alara Vance moved. She didn't run. She flowed. She crossed the safety line in 3 fluid strides, her body moving with an economy of motion that was breathtaking. She didn't shout. She didn't command. She acted. Her first movement was toward the recruit who had fired the negligent discharge. She didn't grab the weapon. Instead, her hand came up, palm flat, and gently but irresistibly guided the barrel of his rifle towards the ceiling. "Safety on," she said, her voice a quiet, calm command that cut through the panic like a surgeon's scalpel. The recruit, his eyes wide with fear, fumbled with the switch, his fingers like clumsy sausages. Vance's fingers found his, guided them to the selector switch, and clicked it into place. "Breathe," she added, her eyes locking with his. The panic in his expression subsided, replaced by a dazed obedience. She then turned to Peterson, who was still staring at his failure. She took his rifle from his unresisting hands, checked the chamber, and placed it on the floor. Her movements were a dance of pure competence, each one precise, necessary, and executed with a serenity that was utterly alien to this environment. Then, she turned to face the problem in the room, the impossible shot. She picked up the discarded rifle, her hands moving with a familiar, practiced grace. She checked the magazine, chambered around, and settled into her stance. It was the stance Colonel Rostova had seen from her window, a posture of perfect balance and lethal potential. The world seemed to slow down. The recruits, Keller, the safety officers, everyone watched mesmerized. She raised the rifle, the stock settling into the hollow of her shoulder as if it were a part of her own body. She didn't seem to aim. She seemed to simply look through the sights. For a heartbeat, she was perfectly still. Then, a single controlled report. A clean, sharp crack. Then another, and another. 3 shots, fired in such quick succession, they sounded like one continuous, stuttering burst. Pop, pop, pop. It was over in less than a second. The deafening silence that followed was more profound than any noise. Everyone stared at the targets. The 3 hostile silhouettes each had a single, perfectly placed simulated hole in the dead center of their head box. The hostage target was untouched. The HVD target, the one that was almost completely obscured, had a single hole drilled through the sliver of black that had been visible over the hostage's shoulder. It was a feat of marksmanship so extraordinary, so far beyond the known limits of the recruits and even Keller himself, that it simply did not compute. It was like watching a child solve a quantum physics equation. It was impossible. Vance lowered the rifle, placed the safety on, and set the weapon down. She turned, her face calm, her work done. The crisis was over. The lesson, however, was just beginning. The recruits stood frozen, their mouths agape. They looked from the impossibly perfect grouping on the target's back to the small, quiet woman who had fired them. The cognitive dissonance was a palpable force in the room, a static shock that left them speechless. Drill Sergeant Keller descended from the catwalk, his face a mask of disbelief. He walked over to the targets, his heavy boots crunching on the spent blank casings. He ran a finger over the hole in the HVD target, as if trying to confirm it was real. He looked at the hostage target, pristine and untouched. He looked at the other 2 hostiles, each with a single, perfectly centered mark. 3 shots. 1 second. An impossible angle. "No way," he whispered, the words barely audible. "That's not possible." His entire worldview, a rigid structure built on the foundation of his own expertise, was crumbling. His authority, which he had wielded like a club, now seemed like a child's toy. He had mistaken a lioness for a lamb, and she had just shown him, without a word, the devastating power of her silence. It was in that moment of stunned silence that the sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell. Colonel Eva Rostova entered the kill house, her stride purposeful, her face grim. She was flanked by 2 military policemen. Her eyes, however, were not on the recruits or on the stunned drill sergeant. They were fixed on Alara Vance. Rostova ignored everyone else. She walked directly to Vance, her boots echoing in the suddenly cathedral-like quiet of the training facility. She stopped 2 feet in front of her. The recruits watched, holding their breath. Keller looked on, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. What happened next would be seared into the memory of every person present. Colonel Rostova, a full-bird colonel, a woman who commanded thousands of soldiers and answered only to generals, drew herself up to her full height. In a single, sharp motion that spoke of decades of discipline and a respect that transcended rank, she raised her hand to her brow and delivered the sharpest, most formal salute of her life. It wasn't the perfunctory salute given to a superior officer. It was a gesture of profound, almost reverent deference. It was the salute one gives to a monarch or to a legend. "Ma'am," Rostova said, her voice crisp and clear, cutting through the thick, humid air. "It is an honor to have you here." Elara Vance simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. "Colonel," she replied, her voice as quiet as ever. The sight of the base commander saluting this unassuming civilian woman sent a shockwave through the assembled recruits. They exchanged confused, panicked glances. Who was she? Why was the colonel saluting her? Keller's face had gone pale, the blood draining from it, leaving a sickly, ashen color. He was beginning to understand the magnitude of his error. He was beginning to realize that the mountain he had been shouting at was, in fact, a volcano, and it was his own foolish pride that had brought him to the edge of its caldera. Rostova held her salute for a moment longer, a silent, public declaration of respect, before dropping her hand. She then turned her gaze, cold and furious, upon Drill Sergeant Keller. "Drill Sergeant," Colonel Rostova began, her voice deceptively calm, yet laced with a steel that made every recruit flinch. "Report. What happened here?" Keller opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly as dry as the dusty floor. He looked at the targets, then at Vance, then back to his commander. "Colonel, we had a breakdown in discipline. A safety violation. The consultant." She stepped in. He stammered, his usual booming confidence utterly gone, replaced by the hesitant uncertainty of a man standing on a trapdoor. Rostova's eyes narrowed. "The consultant? Is that what you call her, Sergeant?" She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You stand on a training ground named after General Mark, Ironjaw Hogan, a man who preached that assumptions are the mother of all failures. And you make an assumption of this magnitude." She gestured towards Vance. "You looked at this woman and you saw a civilian. You saw weakness. You saw someone who didn't belong in your forge." Rostova's words were like surgical strikes, each one hitting a vital point of Keller's pride. "You and your recruits treated her with contempt. I saw from my window. You allowed her to be pushed against a wall. You dismissed her. You did all of this because your vision is limited to the uniform a person wears, not the history they carry." She paused, letting the weight of her condemnation settle over the silent, terrified assembly. She then turned to one of the MPs who held a thin, official-looking file. "Sergeant," she barked at Keller, "perhaps a little professional education is in order." Rostova took the file. She didn't open it immediately. Instead, she looked directly at the recruits, her gaze sweeping over their shamed faces. "You thought she was an observer. You were wrong. She is the observer. You thought she didn't belong here. You were wrong. There is no one on this entire continent who belongs on a battlefield more than she does." She finally opened the file, her voice ringing out in the cavernous space as she began to read. The words fell like hammer blows. "Vance Elara, United States Army, enlisted at 18. Ranger School graduate, honor grad. Special Forces Qualification Course, honor grad. Delta Force Selection and Assessment, passed." A collective gasp went through the recruits. Keller looked as though he had been physically struck. "Combat deployments, 12. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and 5 other locations, so classified their names would mean nothing to you. Recipient of the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor, for Purple Hearts." Rostova looked up from the file, her eyes locking onto Keller's. She was a command sergeant major in the most elite special missions unit this country has. She has forgotten more about close-quarters combat than you will ever know. She wrote the revised doctrine on hostage rescue that you are failing so miserably to teach. The final blow came. delivered with the devastating finality of an executioner's axe. And in 2012, on a mission that is still classified top secret, for actions of valor so extreme they defy belief, Command Sergeant Major Vance was awarded this nation's highest honor for bravery. Rostova paused, her voice thick with emotion and fury. She looked at Keller and the recruits who had pushed Vance against the wall. Then she screamed the words, a sound of pure, righteous anger that shook the very foundations of the building. She's a Medal of Honor recipient, and you pushed her into a wall. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where all sound, all thought, all pride had ceased to exist. The story of what happened in the kill house spread through Fort Jackson like a wildfire in a dry forest. It wasn't transmitted through official channels, but through the military's far more efficient gossip network. The hushed conversations in the mess hall, the late-night whispers in the barracks, the text messages that flew from one platoon to another. It was a modern-day myth being born in real time. The tale grew with each telling, embellished and polished until it took on the quality of folklore. They called her the ghost of the wall, the quiet woman who had humbled the loudest drill sergeant on base with 3 perfect shots and a silence more powerful than any sermon. The recruits of Keller's platoon became unwilling celebrities, marked men who had been present at a moment of legend. They walked with their heads down, the shame of their actions a heavy cloak they couldn't shrug off. Peterson, the recruit who had started the chain reaction of failure, was the most deeply affected. He couldn't sleep. The image of Vance's calm face, the quiet authority in her eyes as she took his rifle, was burned into his memory. It wasn't a memory of rebuke, but of a profound, unspoken lesson. He, and the others who had jostled her, had mistaken quiet for weakness. They had mistaken a lack of ego for a lack of substance. They had learned, in the most humiliating way possible, that the most dangerous people are often the ones you never see coming. Drill Sergeant Keller was officially reprimanded, a black mark on an otherwise stellar record. But the formal punishment was meaningless compared to the internal reckoning he now faced. His entire identity was built on a specific model of strength, loud, aggressive, and physically imposing. Alara Vance had shattered that model with a single, undeniable demonstration of a different kind of power, quiet, precise, and utterly competent. He was a man adrift. The foundations of his professional life had been turned to sand. He replayed the events over and over in his mind. His own arrogant words, the smirking satisfaction he felt as the recruits pushed her, the look of utter disbelief on his face when he saw the targets. It was a gallery of his own foolishness. He had been the gatekeeper, the guardian of a sacred tradition, and he had failed the most fundamental test of a leader, the ability to recognize true expertise, regardless of the package it came in. The institutional response was swift. An order came down from Colonel Rostova's office. Every drill sergeant on the base was to attend a mandatory professional development seminar. The guest lecturer was not named. The subject was simply listed as threat recognition and unconscious bias. Everyone knew who the lecturer would be. Alara Vance, for her part, remained unchanged. She didn't gloat. She didn't participate in the retelling of the story. She simply continued her work, observing training, making quiet notes in a small, leather-bound notebook. She treated Drill Sergeant Keller with the same placid, professional courtesy as before, which was somehow more unnerving for him than any overt anger would have been. Her consistency was a constant reminder of his own failure. The wall itself, the plain, cinder-block exterior of the barracks, became an unofficial monument. Recruits from other companies would walk by it, pointing it out in hushed tones. "That's the wall," they'd say. "That's where they pushed her." It was a physical reminder of the day that assumptions died a very public death at Fort Jackson. It stood as a silent testament to the idea that respect is not a function of volume, but of value, and that true strength doesn't need to announce its presence. A few days later, Drill Sergeant Keller found Alara Vance sitting alone on a simple wooden bench, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple over the distant pine trees. His steps were hesitant as he approached. The roaring giant of the training field was gone, replaced by a man who seemed smaller, diminished. He stood before her, his hands clasped awkwardly, struggling to find the words. For a man whose entire career was built on the power of his voice, the silence was agonizing. "Ma'am," he finally managed to say, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just shame. It was a deep, soul-shaking confusion. Vance didn't look up at him immediately. She continued to watch the sky, as if giving him the space to gather his thoughts. "Sergeant," she acknowledged, her tone neutral. I came to apologize," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "What I said, what I allowed to happen, there's no excuse. It was unprofessional, it was disrespectful, and it was ignorant." He finally looked her in the eye. "I was wrong. I am sorry." Vance turned her head slowly, her gaze meeting his. There was no anger in her eyes, no satisfaction, no "I told you," so there was only a calm, analytical curiosity. "Why were you wrong, Sergeant?" she asked quietly. The question caught him off guard. He had expected anger or perhaps a gracious, dismissive acceptance of his apology. He hadn't expected a philosophical inquiry. I disrespected your rank, your history, your medal," he stammered. "You were wrong before you knew about any of those things," she corrected him gently. "Those things are just symbols, Sergeant. They are the results of actions, not the source of worth. You were wrong because you judged a person's competence based on their appearance. You assumed my gender, my age, and my demeanor were indicators of my ability. Your mistake wasn't disrespecting a hero. Your mistake was disrespecting a human being. The rest is just paperwork." The simple, devastating truth of her words hit him harder than any official reprimand ever could. He had built a career on judging recruits, on breaking them down to build them up. But his judgment was flawed, poisoned by a deep-seated prejudice he never even knew he had. He had been looking for soldiers who looked and acted like him, failing to understand that the deadliest threats and the greatest assets often come in packages you don't expect. He stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. "How?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do you stay so calm? After everything you've seen, everything you've done, how are you so quiet?" Alara Vance looked back towards the horizon, where the last sliver of the sun was disappearing. "Because the work is loud enough," she said. "The mission, the action, the consequences, they are all very loud. There's no need to add to the noise. Competence is quiet. Panic is loud. Ego is loud. Precision is silent." "I just try to be precise." She stood up, her movements still fluid and economical. She looked at the humbled drill sergeant, a man whose entire world had been remade in the span of a few days. "You have an important job, Sergeant Keller. You're not just making soldiers. You are shaping the men who will one day have to make impossible choices. Teach them to be precise. Teach them to see what is really there, not what they expect to see. Teach them that the most important weapon they have is not their rifle, but their ability to control their assumptions." With a final, small nod, she walked away, her silhouette dissolving into the gathering dusk, leaving Keller alone with her words and the profound, life-altering lesson he had just received. The legend of the Ghost of the Wall was now complete. It was no longer just a story about impossible marksmanship. It was a parable about the nature of true strength, a lesson that would be taught at Fort Jackson for a generation to come. 1 year later, a new class of recruits stood in the same sweltering South Carolina heat, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. They were standing in front of the same barracks, listening to their drill sergeant. It was Sergeant Keller, but he was a different man. The volume was still there, a necessary tool of his trade, but the brittle arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant authority that came from a place of hard-won wisdom. He was leaner, his face etched with new lines, but his eyes were clear and focused. He was a better instructor because he had been humbled. He was a better leader because he had been forced to confront the limits of his own knowledge. At the end of the first week of training, he would stop his platoon in front of that now-famous cinderblock wall. "Listen up," he would bark, his voice commanding instant silence. "I'm going to tell you a story. This is not in any field manual. You won't be tested on it. But it is the most important lesson you will learn here at Fort Jackson. He would then tell them the story of the quiet, unassuming woman who had visited their base. He would tell them of his own arrogance, of his own blindness. He would describe, in painstaking detail, how he had misjudged her, how he had allowed his recruits to disrespect her. He spared himself no mercy in the telling. He made himself the villain of the story, the cautionary tale. Then he would describe what happened in the kill house. He would describe the 3 impossible shots, the deafening silence, and the moment a colonel saluted a command sergeant major. He would finish by reciting her service record from memory, his voice filled with a reverence that was now genuine. She never raised her voice, he would tell the wide-eyed recruits. She never boasted. She never demanded respect. She simply demonstrated a level of competence that was undeniable. She proved that what you are is infinitely more important than what you say you are. He would then point to the wall. This is Vance's wall. We call it that to remind ourselves that strength comes in many forms. It reminds us that the quietest person in the room is often the one you should listen to the most. It reminds us that assumptions will get you killed, not just in combat, but in life. Your job as a soldier is to see the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. Learn this lesson now, and it will save your life later. The story became a ritual, a part of the institutional culture of his company. The lesson of Alara Vance was now embedded in the DNA of every soldier he trained. They left basic training with not just the skills to fire a rifle, but with a deeper understanding of humility, respect, and the quiet professionalism that defined the very best of them. Her legacy was not in the medal she kept in a box somewhere, or in the classified files that bore her name. Her true legacy was here, in the changed heart of a drill sergeant, and in the minds of the hundreds of young soldiers who would carry her story with them into the world. They would be better soldiers and better people because of the day a ghost walked their halls and reminded them that true power doesn't need to shout. It was a legacy of silence, a legacy of competence, a legacy that continued to ripple outwards long after she was gone. The essence of a legacy is not a static thing, not a monument carved in stone or a name etched onto a plaque. It is a living, breathing force. It is a lesson passed from one generation to the next, a standard that inspires others to be better, a story that reshapes the culture of an institution from the inside out. Alara Vance never sought to become a legend. Legends are loud, and she was a creature of silence. Yet, her actions on that one hot afternoon created a legacy more potent and enduring than any statue. It became a teaching point, a piece of institutional folklore used to inoculate new soldiers against the poison of prejudice. Her quiet competence became the new gold standard, a powerful counter-narrative to the chest-thumping bravado that can sometimes be mistaken for strength. Years would pass. Soldiers trained by the reformed Sergeant Keller would go on to their own careers, taking the story of Vance's wall with them. They would tell it to their own subordinates in firebases in Afghanistan and on peacekeeping missions in Africa. The story of the quiet woman who outshot, outthought, and outclassed everyone without raising her voice became a touchstone, a reminder of the core principles of their profession. It taught them that observation is a weapon, that humility is a shield, and that respect is a currency earned through action, not demanded by rank. The true triumph was not that a hero was finally recognized. It was that an entire community was forced to redefine its understanding of what a hero looks like. They learned that a warrior's heart is not measured by the size of their frame or the volume of their voice, but by the stillness of their hands and the clarity of their purpose. Alara Vance showed them that the most profound strength is the one that has nothing to prove. It is the calm at the center of the storm, the quiet professional who steps out of the shadows when they are needed most and fades back into them when the work is done, leaving behind nothing but a better world and a story that whispers the truth. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in a display case. It's what continues forward in the actions of others. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.